Hey everybody, my name's Christo Avalis. For those who don't know me, I'm a political commentator, a writer, historian, postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto, and this is my first YouTube video. And today I kind of want to talk about a concept that's pretty popular in the media today. It's kind of re-emerged in recent months and recent weeks, and it's the idea of class conflict. Often you'll hear politicians often on the right say that the left is obsessed with class conflict, that they are jealous of the wealthy and successful and ambitious, that they want to leech off their success, to pull them down because they are, afraid of their own failures. And often you'll see people from the center talk about, conflict between people and how we just have to, unite despite our differences. And people like Joe Biden, for instance, talk about how, regular Americans and billionaires are just as progressive as one another. And one of the challenges I feel, and this is perhaps the most troubling, is that on the left, we know class conflict is happening. We know it's happening. We see the rich getting richer. We see the poor continuing to struggle. We see middle-class people having difficulties with things that, maybe their parents' generation didn't have. And yet we're not willing to call it what it is. We're not willing to take on the mantle of embracing class conflict. And it's not a secret. This is kind of a semi-famous quote on the internet. You have Warren Buffett, famous billionaire investor, who basically said at one point that, there is class warfare in this country. There is class warfare in the United States he's referring to, but really it's a global phenomenon. He says there's no point in denying it. The reality is there is class conflict. It's happening. The rich are the ones doing it, and they're winning. And put another way, the 1% is waging a war on the 99%, and they're doing quite well. And so I think one of the things I talked about it on the Rational National with David Doyle. I'll put a link in the description to this recently. I've written about it in Canadian Dimension and in other sources, where we need to start looking at embracing class conflict again. We really need to put that front and center in the left's discourse. I mean, historically it was there, and not just necessarily amongst communists necessarily, right? It really was something that permeated the left. Perhaps one of the most famous example many Canadians would know is the Tommy Douglas's story of Mouseland. For those who don't know, you can, if you Google or check on YouTube Mouseland, a video will pop up. It's fantastic. And the basic story is Tommy Douglas, former leader of the New Democratic Party, told the story of Mouseland, where all the little mice work and play and live and die, and they vote for a government, and every 4 or 5 years they elect a government made up of cats. And the cats pass laws that are good for cats. They'll try the white cats one year, they'll try the black cats the next, but it doesn't matter fundamentally. Small changes, of course, happen, but it doesn't matter fundamentally because the government is made up of cats. So, Douglas basically goes on to suggest that, the mice have to elect a government for themselves, which is to elect a government that represents the 99%, which represents farmers and workers and all of those people who didn't have their interests represented by the cats. And it's presented as this fable in a sense, and Tommy Douglas is not who you would see as a class warrior. He's very happy going. He was a very kind man. He was a very soft-spoken man. He was voted Canada's greatest Canadian in a kind of CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, kind of poll about a decade and a half ago. Seen as the father of Medicare and somebody that all Canadians can support, at least in a partial sense. But in reality, he was a democratic socialist who didn't believe in violent class conflict by any means, but who believed that we had a fundamental, issue of class conflict in our society, and that the mice, the many, had to rise up against the feline few in a sense. And this kind of lines up with some of the rhetoric you're hearing from Jeremy Corbyn in Britain, certainly, but it lines up really well with, even with FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one of America's most famous presidents, himself not a socialist. He would identify as a liberal, and I think he would that would be a largely accurate definition. But the reality is in his time as president, during the 1930s especially, he was undertaking a ambitious program of social, economic, and cultural reform within the United States, and that made him an enemy of his fellow wealthy Americans. And in 1936, he would say as much. He would give a speech saying that, and I'm paraphrasing again, that Americans, the American elite had never been so united in their hatred of one presidential candidate. And what he said was crucial there. He said, "I welcome that hatred." And that's so important. That's so important because the reality today is that many progressives seem to want to be liked by everybody. They want to be liked by everyone. They want to be the candidate for all of the classes. They want to represent workers, but they also want to represent the middle class, but they also want to represent professionals, but they also want to represent the very elite, big businesses, Wall Street, Bay Street, what have you. And you can't do that. You can't represent them all. I don't want to be overly simplistic, but in our society, you have to be with the many or with the few, fundamentally. And the few understand that. The few understand that better than everyone. There's no class consciousness like the class consciousness the elite has. But workers, the regular folks, we don't understand that as much, for whatever reason. And so I think it's really important that we've seen a few politicians in the United States seem to embrace, if only partially, the rhetoric of class conflict. And I think two figures really stand out, although I think you should give at least some partial credit to people like Elizabeth Warren. I think the two figures that really stand out in my view from the U.S. are Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Sanders, of course, had, his whole rhetoric was taking on the millionaire and billionaire classes. And he made no qualms about that. When asked about how he would, support his political and social vision, he didn't hide the fact that it would be on the backs of the rich. That those people who had benefited for so long on a system that keeps millions and millions of Americans poor, precarious, unhealthy, and undignified in their work and beyond their workplace, the reckoning is coming. The reckoning is coming. And that there's a need for fundamental social change in the United States. And the rich will pay for it because the rich had been freeloading for generations. And Bernie would point out to, not only do corporations get massive tax cuts, but they pay their workers so little that in effect, the public, regular taxpayers, are effectively subsidizing companies like Amazon and Walmart and other major corporations who pay their workers so little that they have to survive on food stamps and other forms of social benefits as, their municipalities and states provide. And the reality is Bernie was challenging that. And he didn't just challenge that on policy, he challenged that on rhetoric. And I think that's absolutely vital because Bernie would say, when asked hypothetically, what would you say to a hedge fund manager who said, Bernie, I don't like your vision, or Bernie, I don't think I can vote for you. And what would Bernie say to that? And Bernie said, well, look, I would tell him frankly, you shouldn't vote for me. It's not in your interest to vote for me. And you should be concerned about my political vision because it's in direct opposition to yours. I don't serve your interests, and there's no reason you should vote for me. And Bernie understands that because, one, he's being honest, and two, he knows the mathematics of the game, which is that if you want meaningful working class change, the only way you're going to do that, the only way you can defeat organized money, is through the sheer democratic weight of the vast majority of regular people. It hasn't always worked, but it's the only tool we got. So we have to make it work. And that's what Bernie understands. And the politics of that is that, look, the rich people aren't going to vote for him anyway. And Ocasio-Cortez has made this a similar issue as well, on a couple key policy fronts. Again, one on policy and one on rhetoric. She has brought up the idea, again, of returning to very high marginal tax rates on the richest Americans, 70% in some cases. And this is a return to a time where there was a sort of compromise between the rich and the rest in the decades after World War II, a time that is kind of noted for high levels of prosperity in both Canada and the United States. But the reality is that it's important because that kind of discussion really raises not only this idea of how we're going to fund things, but it's not just about funding. It's about really challenging the idea that that much wealth is needed by any person. And Ocasio-Cortez would say as much. She didn't necessarily say that, billionaires inherently are immoral, that a society with billionaires is immoral. Although she did say that any society with even a smidgen of poverty and insecurity, where people don't have the health care they need or a dignified job or a dignified existence, and that is juxtaposed to also having billionaires, that is an immoral society. So in effect, in all practicalities, Ocasio-Cortez is saying we can have billionaires or we can have a dignified life for all. We probably can't have both. So we need to have a fundamental discussion about that tension in our society. And I think that these developments have been very encouraging. It's not necessarily that those policies will come to pass, although Bernie Sanders, I would add, I think has at least played something of a role in Bezos and Amazon raising that company's minimum wage in the United States to $15 an hour. I don't think it's a coincidence that Bernie Sanders introduces the Bezos bill, and then in the coming weeks and months, Jeff Bezos moves to a new wage structure at the company. I don't think that's an accident. It's just such a crucial moment in American politics. And I think that brings us to talk a bit about Canada here, to talk a little bit about the New Democratic Party, which, for full disclosure, for those who know me and my writing, they know that I am a supporter of the party. I also, to a degree, hold office in the party. I am a vice president of my riding association, basically. I'm not a paid person. I've never been a paid staff person of the NDP, although I am a donor to the party and I am a volunteer for the party. I've at times done communications where on political panels I've been the NDP talking head, if you will. So I come to this as a kind of party loyalist in a sense, although I should say that loyalism doesn't bring me above critiquing the party. But I come to this as an NDPer, and I raise the fact that we have a lot to learn from the developments of Jeremy Corbyn, whose whole line has been about re-engaging with the class realities of Britain, which are even stronger than our own, but re-engaging with that and for lack of a better term, weaponizing it against the powers that be. And Bernie Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez, who are dealing with an American country where perhaps it's a bit easier to take fire at someone like Donald Trump than it is at most figures, because he's so uniquely and utterly deservedly reviled for the terrible man he is and terrible president he is. But we need to learn from this. And I think that one of the failures of the NDP, frankly, since the crash in 2008, and a lot of this goes to Tom Mulcair, but even some of it to Jack Layton, frankly, is that there was this desire to be the party for all. And that's just not possible. That's just not possible to genuinely and effectively be that party. The Liberals can pretend to be that party because they're seen as the party of the center, but ultimately they don't act in everyone's interests equally. They do tend to throw some bones around, but ultimately they're a party of the elite, of the top 1 or 5% of the economy. The NDP doesn't have that luxury. And during Tom Mulcair's leadership especially, he really had this desire to be a party that supposedly everyone could vote for and find something of value. He wanted to be loved by business, not just small businesses, individual small businesses, but by rather conservative groups like the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. He sought to work with them in some cases, even though they have deeply anti-union views. Tom Mulcair really tried to avoid any kind of discussion around taxing the wealthy even a little bit more, talking about capital gains taxation. Sure, he did try to fight some corporate loopholes, but there was nothing from him that fundamentally said, we're going to challenge the economic status quo. And so, in a way, he went into the 2015 election, which, for those for those who don't follow Canadian politics, the NDP was at times in first place, but ended up finishing in a fairly distant third. He went into that election with this, I am a man for all classes rhetoric, and he lost. And he lost because there were some people looking for progressive change. Justin Trudeau promised it, didn't ultimately deliver on most fronts, but he promised it, and he was credible to most of the electorate, and so he won. But the reality is the NDP is never trusted to be that moderate party, even when they run as it. even when they run as something of a very mildly center-left party, the powers that be won't trust them. Conrad Black, that gentleman of the Canadian media, Conrad Black, wrote in the kind of run-up to that election that, he doesn't trust the NDP to govern. He doesn't trust them. But you know who he does trust? He trusts Justin Trudeau. He has reservations, but he ultimately trusts Trudeau and the Liberal Party. Conrad Black is not a Liberal. He's somebody fairly on the right. But Conrad Black said he could trust the Liberal Party, and there's a reason why. It's because that party still fundamentally represents the same elite interest of the Conservatives. In different ways, yes, but still represents those interests. So, in a sense, the NDP will be branded as a socialist party, even when they don't run with a definitive socialist position. So where does that bring us today? Well, today we have Jagmeet Singh. He's the new leader of the New Democrats, relatively new. He's currently seeking a by-election in Burnaby South. It's looking good there, although nothing can be certain. The reality is, however, he needs to do more to push this idea of class conflict. Now, he did some of that in his leadership race. In his leadership race, he had what I would call a fairly ambitious tax policy program, and these are the basics of it. Was one, it would be a 4% increase to the marginal tax rate to the highest incomes, and then another 2% to those just below it. Basically, the creation of two new top marginal tax brackets. Not to the extent that Ocasio-Cortez would be pushing a 70% marginal tax rate, but notable increases nonetheless. There would also be I believe around a 4% increase to the corporate tax rate. But I think the two most crucial programs, because these really do make fundamental changes, is raising the capital gains inclusion rate from 50% to 75%, basically having the bonus that investors and other forms of non-labor income having the advantage that they currently get over labor-based income. Many of us feel that should be totally eliminated, that capital gains should be taxed as labor income, but it's a significant move nonetheless. And Jagmeet Singh also proposed a 40% estate tax on all estates over $4 million. Now that excludes the family home, but still that would be a significant tax on Canada's wealthiest families, and would help fund certain programs, but more importantly would be I think a victory for equality of opportunity in this country. And so what I feel is that the NDP is in a tricky position. They're still seen as the party of the left. Many on Canada's left don't always see it that way. I still have faith in that vision. But the reality is that they need to take more pride in those positions. They're positions Jagmeet Singh has taken. There's positions that are in the policy books. There are positions that historically we've believed in, and that the members at least still believe in today. And crucially, there are policies that the conservatives and liberals and conservative and liberal leaning media will tar and feather us with regardless. They'll say we're radical. They'll say the NDP believes in nationalization. They'll say the NDP believes in social programs that are too ambitious. They'll say the NDP believes in soaking the rich. And the reality is that whether that's true or not, that's the branding. So rather than clutching our pearls and wanting to look respectable to the Canadian elite, the 1 or 2% who will never vote for us, let's acknowledge the class conflict. Let's say, the National Post, the Toronto Sun, they're saying that, Jagmeet Singh, Sven Robinson, Nikki Ashton, Charlie Angus, all the MPs, they want to attack the most successful Canadians and make our country, a socialist haven. And we should say, yeah, we do. We are a believer in class warfare. We didn't start it. We didn't start this conflict where, a few Canadian families have more wealth than the entirety of the maritime provinces. We didn't start this conflict where, Galen Weston, one of Canada's richest men, is ripping off people for bread money, basically fixing bread prices for a decade or more, and then he gives some gift cards out, and he's like, well, I guess my job is done. But like the billionaires in this country, the millionaires in this country have gotten an easy ride for far too long. The shine of the American oligarchs has almost allowed them to sit in the shade. And I think the NDP needs to say, look, Yeah, we believe in class conflict. What's wrong with fighting for working people and fighting with working people every day? What's wrong with that? And I know Jagmeet wants to have a positive image. Jagmeet wants to be who he is, which is he's young, he's handsome, he's charismatic, he's charming. He wants to have that image, and that's who he is, and I don't think he should shed that. But I think it's important to note that while, Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders they're known to get riled up. They get angry. They, call out the billionaires. Ocasio-Cortez went on, I believe it was Colbert, and said, I give zero fucks about, I'm using her language, about what some of these centrist Democrats think of me and my policies. But the thing is, Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders, they have a lot of fun. Ocasio-Cortez, she dances. She goes on charity streams with H-Bomb to talk about trans rights. She, does streams where she chats with her supporters as she cooks meals and stuff. She's engaging in these fun and positive ways. And Bernie Sanders as well, there's the shooting the basketball around, all the fun he had with his young supporters, those great moments where the bird landed on his podium and it became this great moment. And I think Jagmeet could see an opportunity, to be both the fun, positive guy he is, but still embrace the reality of class conflict in this country. And some of this is coming out. Again, it's in his tax policy. His housing plan certainly looks at this. He's basically said, look, our liberal government's not doing enough to build housing. This is a fundamental human right, and we're going to prioritize this. And it's not about landlords, and it's not about, protecting that class. It's about getting housing for the Canadians who need it. But I feel that that's the direction he needs to go in. That's the direction we as a party, in a sense, need to go in this 2019 election. We need to, find a bit of our mojo again. The opportunity is, we're already branded with that brush. We're already painted that way. So let's go with that direction. So thanks so much for listening to this first video on my new channel. If you like it, you like the ideas in it, the content, feel free to share it around with your friends, those who are like-minded. Be sure to click the subscribe button so that you can see new content as it appears. And leave a comment. I'd love to hear what you think. Do you think that the left in Canada, the United States, Britain, or wherever you're listening from, do you think that we need to lean into this idea of class conflict and tell the voters the truth of the situation and how we can go about building a just society?